Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another Potted History, where I take some of history's most famous events and giving you 20 minutes of brief yet detailed accounts of those events. For this week, I'm going to be looking at the Blitz period, the most sort of famous period from the Second World War here in the UK, a time of hardship, but also a time of enduring and keeping, spirits up. It is sort of synonymous with the Second World War here in the UK, and I just want to sort of broaden your horizons about what the Blitz was really about. So without further ado, here is that content. Now the Blitz, as I mentioned, is a most famous period of Second World War British history. Blitz comes from the word lightning in German. These sort of lightning bombing raids that would occur on a nightly basis. At first coming sort of in the daytime on occasion, but solely during the nights by the October of 1940. But the Blitz was part of a wider period of history known as the Battle of Britain, a subject of which I made a short video on a few weeks ago, and a link I will put up in this corner here. Now the Battle of Britain, in very short detail, not to spoil anything from the previous video, is the assault on Britain to try and demoralise, to try and target main ports and areas on the south coast so that Operation Sea Lion, the Germans' main assault onto Britain, could come into fruition and then from there spread up. But the Blitz was a sort of a plan B to those initial raids, because the bombing raids on the ports and the airfields along the south coast just simply weren't working. They were obviously finding their targets, but it wasn't damaging to the war effort of the British that much. So on the 6th of September 1940, Adolf Hitler decided that a new tactic was needed: bombing raids on the major industrial towns and cities of the UK, places which had ties to the war effort, for the munitions factory, for building tanks and vehicles, where the ports were, where the airfields were, all of these major cities. Just think of any major city in the UK: Sheffield, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Cardiff, you name it. Any major city that either has a port or a main industrial centre, the Germans were likely targeting that area. We often think of the Blitz as being solely on London, and that evacuations were coming out of London, and all of the Germans' effort was focused on London. In fact, Liverpool was the second deadliest and most destructive city to be targeted by the German Blitz bombing raids during this period of history. In separate occasions, there are 8 separate occasions where an average of 250 tons of bombs and destructive capability was dropped on the city of Liverpool. Now, you might wonder why Liverpool was this second most deadly, or the most deadly outside of London. You see, during the war, Liverpool had the Merseyside Quay and the port, as well as the main industrial city itself. But not only was it that a central point and a central target for the Germans, it was also key for the main Atlantic imports coming into the UK, giving materials and building the war effort for the British. Up to 90% of all of the materials used during the war effort in Second World War were coming through the Merseyside Quays and the Merseyside port, which measured just 11 miles in length, or 18 kilometres if you're measuring in that measurement. So 90%, that's up to 75 million tonnes of materials that were coming through that particular port and that particular city itself. So you can see why the Germans chose Liverpool as this second target to choose. Similarly, in London, there are 71 separate occasions, separate bombing raids, where an average of 250 tons of explosive materials, bombs, is dropped onto the city. Now, while this doesn't really necessarily compare with Liverpool and other major cities that have had major bombing raids of this degree, and it is probably why we've focused so much on London as the sort of Blitz area, it just goes to show that there are other cities that were affected and there are major targets. For example, the Liverpool target, which I just mentioned, where these things were happening. And I think that we need to sort of broaden our horizons in terms of, this period of history and learn more about the Blitz as a whole and not just the Blitz in London. Now, the Blitz began on the 7th of September 1940. The day previous was obviously that initial ordering by Adolf Hitler. And from the 7th of September, for the first 57 days, there were 56 consecutive bombing raids on London and the rest of the British targets, Liverpool and the major cities. Some of these were day raids. In the very early stages of the Blitz, these were day raids. But by the time you get to the October of 1940, these become solely nighttime raids, which we are sort of familiar with in the Second World War. The largest assault of which came on the 15th of September 1940. The very early stages of the Blitz period. Now, this became known, the 15th of September became known as the Battle of Britain Day, where 1,500 aircraft took to the skies to either defend or to attack British shores, London, and the rest of the major targets across Britain. Now, obviously, the British came out on top in all of this. We only suffered 29 destroyed aircraft. Only one airman was actually captured. 14 were wounded, and unfortunately 16 servicemen lost their lives during the Battle of Britain Day. But on the other hand, there was almost a doubling or a 3 times amount of loss and damage on the German side. There were up to 60 destroyed aircraft, up to 65 captured servicemen, 31 wounded individuals, and unfortunately 81 servicemen lost their life during their assaults on the British cities and the major targets in the UK. Now, this first 57 days of the Blitz counts as the first phase of the war, of the Blitz period. The second phase comes between the November of 1940 and February 1941, with the final phase being between February and May 1941, when there weren't as many raids coming through. Obviously they still happened, but because of the shift from Britain towards Russia in terms of who the Germans were targeting next, the raids on Britain from February to May were becoming few and far between, and there was less of them as Operation Barbarossa was taking hold and in its planning and early stages. But this is the part of the video where it gets a little bit somber, because 2 million houses were destroyed and up to 40,000 people tragically lost their lives during this Blitz, this 9-month Blitz period. Half of which were centred in London, but it doesn't detract from the fact that other cities across the countries were being affected by this same catastrophe too. As I said, Liverpool was a major port and a major area for the war effort, and other cities around the country equally had major stakes within the war, within their sort of ports and their industrial capabilities. But let's just consider London again, because in 1940 there was a population of 8.1 million people, and the death figure for London was 20,000, a little over 20,000. This could have been exponentially bigger had there not been the proper organisation, the proper facilities and the proper accommodation to keep the city as well as the citizens in it safe. Morrison shelters and Anderson shelters, the two most sort of common bunkers that we sort of see within the UK as being the main protection for people, they were being given out, the materials for them were being given out for free for those on the lowest of incomes, so that they too could create and keep themselves safe from the German bombs. Anderson shelters were brilliant for shock absorption because they were buried about 4 feet deep underground, as well as having a layer of corrugated iron and soil on top. And the Morrison shelters, which were sort of more like little tables, would hide underneath them, and they had 3mm thick steel, which would be able to, withstand the weight of the rubble of the house should there be an explosion, sort of direct contact. But you also have to consider the evacuation plans and the other organizations that were utilized during the Blitz in order to keep the city and its citizens safe from the German Luftwaffe and their Blitz bombing. As I mentioned just a moment ago, the London population was 8.1 million in 1940. Skip ahead a year later, there is only 7.9 million individuals. Now, that's almost 200,000 people that have been evacuated from the streets of London, from their homes, into the countryside, into places where the Luftwaffe weren't interested, where there wasn't any major port or major industrial zone. These were mostly children, as we all know, but these were also pregnant women, ill individuals, and others that were deemed at risk from sort of the German bombings. In total, across the country, in other cities, there were other evacuation plans. By February of 1941, up to 1.4 million people were evacuated into the countryside and away from the major cities and away from the danger of the Blitz. That's just one effort of the war. The other effort is through the major organizations that were utilized to keep the city safe. So you have the air wardens, who in 1939 enforced blackout periods, well before there was even a threat of bombing raids. There was the fire service, who were created in 1938 in preparation of this war, in order to, should there ever be a Blitz period, and thankfully, thankful God that they were there, because they were there to put out the fires and to assist where others could not. And even in the Women's Voluntary Service, which again was part of this 1938 sort of inauguration, these were volunteers also that helped assist and those that were vulnerable across the UK. There were almost 2 million members to each of these individual organisations, which made up a civil defence service. In 1941, they were sort of all amalgamated together by 1941. There was almost 2 million people that were part of these 3 separate organisations. 120,000 of them were full-time members, and unfortunately 2,500 individuals sadly lost their lives during this Blitz period and during this era. And they too should be commended for their services for actually keeping the city standing and keeping the citizens safe from any harm and damage that were caused by the Blitz. But when it comes to the quick turnarounds within cities, this was about recreating a sense of normality, to clearing away the rubble and to acting as if nothing has happened. These sort of quick turnarounds, rebuilding and re-energizing the cities, again to give a sense of normality back. Sometimes these would take up to 2 weeks after major bombing raids. On some occasions, in like the city of Birmingham, it took up to 3 months. And this is what really confused the Germans and really confused them enough to turn their attention away from Britain and unfortunately onto the USSR, but again away from Britain. It was the sense of Blitz spirit, just keeping going, just carrying on with your head held high, and even in the face of a major adversary or all this doom and gloom, there was a sense of hope, And in recent weeks, during this sort of crisis that we've been having in 2020, people have been using this phrase, this Blitz spirit phrase, as a means of saying, well, we'll get through this. We will come out of this and we will be back to normal at some point. We just need to keep going and keep our spirits up. And that is the end of the video. I do certainly hope that you have enjoyed this video, and I hope that you have been able to broaden your knowledge about this very specific and quite well-known period of British history during the Second World War. If you'd like to make any comments, perhaps something I might have gotten slightly wrong, or maybe want me to know more about, please do drop a comment below. Also, I would greatly appreciate it if you were to like and subscribe to this channel. There are links in the description for my Instagram and Facebook pages, where I do a few different things, not just sort of history-based stuff. But yes, I'm going to end the video here, and I will see you next week with another Wednesday weekly video, or perhaps another 5-minute short with my summer series. See you later.